A Humane Economy, the Social Framework of the Free Market, 1958, by Wilhelm Röpke. Excerpts read by Jim Kelly. From Chapter 1, Reappraisal After 15 Years. Those who, like myself, were born a few weeks before the close of the last 19th century can regard themselves as coevals of or coinciding with the 20th century, although they cannot hope to see its end. As anyone who has, as I have, the somewhat doubtful privilege of having been born a national of one of the great powers, and moreover, one of the most turbulent powers of this great, tragic continent, and who has shared its varied fate throughout the phases of his life, may add, like millions of others, that his experience spans a wider range than is normally given to a man. What has been the impact of this experience and of its interpretation on a man like myself? Perhaps the one thing I know most definitely is something negative. I can hardly describe myself as a socialist in any meaningful or commonly accepted sense. It took me a long time to become quite clear on this point, but today it seems to me that this statement, properly understood, is the most clear-cut, firm, and definite part of my beliefs. But this is where the problem begins. Where does a man of my kind take his stand if he is to attack socialism because he believes it to be wrong? Is the standpoint of liberalism the right one to deliver his attack? In a certain sense, yes, if liberalism is understood as faith in a particular social technique, that is, in a particular economic order. If it is liberal to entrust economic order not to planning, coercion, and penalties, but to the spontaneous and free cooperation of people through the market, price, and competition, and at the same time to regard property as the pillar of this free order, then I speak as a liberal when I reject socialism. The technique of socialism, that is, economic planning, nationalization, the erosion of property, and the cradle-to-the-grave welfare state, has done great harm in our time. On the other hand, we have the irrefutable testimony of the last 15 years, particularly in Germany, that the opposite, the liberal technique of the market economy, opens the way to well-being, freedom, the rule of law, the distribution of power, and international cooperation. These are the facts, and they demand the adoption of a firm position against the socialist and for the liberal kind of economic order. In the last resort, the distinction between socialists and non-socialists is one which divides men who hold basically different views of life and its true meaning, and of the nature of man and society. Cardinal Manning's statement that, quote, all human differences are ultimately religious ones, end quote, goes to the core of the matter. The view we take of man's nature and position in the universe ultimately determines whether we choose man himself or, in the alternative, society, the group, or the community, as our standard of reference for social values. Our decision on this point becomes the watershed of our political thinking, even though we may not always be clearly aware of this and may take some time to realize it. This remains true in spite of the fact that, in most cases, people's political thinking is by no means in line with their most profound religious and philosophical convictions, because intricate economic or other questions mask the conflict. People may be led by Christian and humane convictions to declare themselves in sympathy with socialism, and may actually believe that this is the best safeguard of man's spiritual personality against the encroachments of power. But they fail to see that this means favoring a social and economic order which threatens to destroy their ideal of man and human freedom. There remains the hope that one may be able to make them aware of their error and persuade them by means of irrefutable, or at least reasonable, arguments that their choice in the field of economic and social order may have consequences which are diametrically opposed to their own philosophy. As far as I myself am concerned, what I reject in socialism is a philosophy which places too little emphasis on man, his nature, and his personality, and which, at least in its enthusiasm for anything that may be described as organization, concentration, management, and administrative machinery, makes light of the danger that all this may lead to the sacrifice of freedom in the plain and tragic sense exemplified by the totalitarian state. My picture of man is fashioned by the spiritual heritage of classical and Christian tradition. I see in man the likeness of God. I am profoundly convinced that it is an appalling sin to reduce man to a means, even in the name of high-sounding phrases, and that each man's soul is something unique, irreplaceable, and priceless in comparison with which all other things are not. I am attached to a humanism which is rooted in these convictions and which regards man as the child and image of God, but not as God himself, to be idolized as he is by the hubris of a false and atheist humanism. These, I believe, are the reasons why I so greatly distrust all forms of collectivism. Thus we announce the theme, which is the red thread running through this book. The vital things are those beyond supply and demand and the world of property. It is they which give meaning, dignity, and inner richness to life. Those purposes and values of which belong to the realm of ethics in the widest sense. There is a profound ethical reason why an economy governed by free prices, free markets, and free competition implies health and plenty, while the socialist economy means sickness, disorder, and lower productivity. The liberal economic system releases and utilizes the extraordinary forces inherent in individual self-assertion, whereas the socialist system suppresses them and wears itself out in opposing them. We have every reason to distrust the moralizing attitudes of those who condemn the free economy because they regard the individual's attempts to assert and advance himself by productive effort as ethically questionable, and prefer an economic system which summons the power of the state against them. Now, nothing is more detrimental to a sound general order appropriate to human nature than two things: mass and concentration. Individual responsibility and independence in proper balance with the community, neighborly spirit, and true civic sense. All of these presuppose that the communities in which we live do not exceed the human scale. In all fields, mass and concentration are the work of modern society. They smother the area of individual responsibility, life, and thought, and give the strongest impulse to collective thought and feeling. The small circles, from the family on up, with their human warmth and natural solidarity, are giving way before mass and concentration, before the amorphous conglomeration of people in huge cities and industrial centers, before rootlessness and mass organizations, before the anonymous bureaucracy of giant concerns, and, eventually, of government itself, which holds this crumbling society together through coercive machinery of the welfare state, the police, and the tax screw. This is what was ailing modern society even before the Second World War, and since then the illness has become more acute and quite unmistakable. It is a desperate disease calling for the desperate cure of decentralization and deproletarianization. People need to be taken out of the masses and given roots again. Nor should we deceive ourselves about all the forces of spiritual and moral decay there are at work everywhere in the name of modern living, or about the claims which this magic formula is naively supposed to justify. We should know where all this will end unless we stop it in time. It is no use seeking salvation in institutions, programs, and projects. We shall save ourselves only if more and more of us have the unfashionable courage to take counsel with our own souls and, in the midst of all this modern hustle and bustle, to consider the firm, enduring, and proved truths of life. This brings me to the very center of my convictions, which, I hope, I share with many others. I have always been reluctant to talk about it because I am not one to air my religious views in public. But let me say it here quite plainly. The ultimate source of our civilization's disease is the spiritual and religious crisis which has overtaken all of us and which each must master for himself. Above all, man is homo religiosus, and yet, for the past century, we have made the desperate attempt to get along without God. And in the place of God, we have set up the cult of man, his profane or even ungodly science and art, his technical achievements, and his state. We may be certain that someday the whole world will come to see, in a blinding flash, what is now clear to only a few, namely, that this desperate attempt has created a situation in which man can have no spiritual and moral life, and this means that he cannot live at all for any length of time, in spite of television and speedways and holiday trips and comfortable departments. We seem to have proved the existence of God in yet another way, by the practical consequences of his assumed non-existence. Surely, no one who is at all honest with himself can fail to be struck by the shocking de-Christianization and secularization of our culture. We may try to seek comfort in remembering that this is not the first time that Christianity has ceased to be a living force. As long ago as the 18th century, it looked, mainly in France, but to some extent also in England, as if the Christian tradition and Christian faith had irretrievably lost their hold. It is important and interesting to remember this, and it reminds us that today's lack of religion has its historical origin in the 18th century deism or open atheism. But this is cold comfort. However much the content of the Christian tradition was diluted at that time, most people, with all their skepticism and secularism, still believed in a divine order and in a life whose meaning extended beyond this world. But in our times, the situation is radically different. Although in contrast to the situation in the 18th century, a minority takes its faith more seriously than ever and gathers round the equally steadfast churches, the dominating and prevailing opinion is completely atheistic. And since men obviously cannot live in a religious vacuum, they cling to surrogate religions of all kinds, to political passions, ideologies, and pipe dreams, unless, of course, they prefer to drug themselves with the sheer mechanics of producing and consuming, with sport and betting, with sexuality, with rowdiness and crime, and the thousand other things which fill our daily newspapers. It is a poor species of human being which this grim vision conjures up before our eyes. Fragmentary and disintegrated man, the end product of growing mechanization, specialization, and functionalization, which decompose the unity of human personality and dissolve it in the mass. An aborted form of Homo sapiens created by a largely technical civilization, a race of spiritual and moral pygmies lending itself willingly, indeed gladly, because that way lies redemption, to use as raw material for the modern collectivist and totalitarian mass state. At the same time, this new type of man is spiritually homeless and morally shipwrecked. His capacity for true religious faith and for cherishing cultural traditions having been worn away by too much cerebral and psychoanalytic introspection, he looks for surrogates in the fanatically intolerant political and social ideologies of our time, or social religions, as Alfred Weber aptly calls them. At the top of the list are socialism, communism, and nationalism. The essential symptom of our cultural crisis is precisely that we are losing the inner certainty which the Christian and humanistic belief in the unity of civilization and man gave us. To overcome the crisis means to regain this certainty. We can save ourselves only if man finds the way back to himself and to the firm shore of his own nature, assured value judgments, and binding faith. At the same time, let there be no doubt about it, man must, of course, also master the immense problems for which we have to thank the unexampled upheaval in our external forms of living. What we have to fear is a development which, like inflation, is a creeping process and, as will be shown, is indeed closely connected with the creeping inflation of our times. Social and personal comforts are rated more highly than freedom, law, and personality. That which still goes under the name of freedom is, as often as not, license, arbitrariness, laxity, and unlimited demands. Few people today attach to the word freedom any clear meaning which might put them on guard against its demagogic abuse. The individual means less and less, mass and collectivity more and more. And so the net of servitude which hems in personal development becomes ever denser, more closely meshed, and inescapable. The center of gravity of decisions keeps shifting upwards, from the individual, the family, and the small compact group, up to anonymous institutions. The power of the state grows uncontrollably, yet, since powerful forces are at the same time eroding its structure and weakening the sense of community, there is less and less assurance that administration and legislation unswervingly serve the whole nation and its long-term interest. Demagogy and pressure groups turn politics into the art of finding the way of least resistance and immediate expediency, or into a device for channeling other people's money to one's own group. Government, legislation, and politics of this kind are bound to forfeit public esteem and lose their moral authority. They are alarmingly exposed to contempt, lawlessness, and lack of public spirit, and to corruption in all forms and degrees. Those who serve government, legislation, or politics experience in their turn a corresponding loss of esteem, and this impairs their capacity for resistance to the forces undermining the state. The vicious circle closes. It is all the more vicious since, at the same time, the sheer power of the state, the area of legislation, and the influence of politics have grown enormously and are still expanding, even where governments have assumed office with the explicit promise of lightening this burden. Law and the principles of law, which should be as a rock, become uncertain. For Locke, the individual had an inalienable right to life, liberty, and property. But today, even in the free world, the last named pillar of property is badly dilapidated, and few realize that its fall would pull down the pillar of liberty as well, and that the remaining pillar, the right to the inviolability of life, could not then stand alone. People are still in the habit of taking refuge in official regulations whenever a new problem turns up. In Europe, this takes the particularly absurd form of expecting any problem found intractable on the national scale to be solved on an international scale by a supranational authority. Behind the facade of the market economy, people are still, consciously or unconsciously, promoting a development which leads to bureaucratic rigidity and the omnipotence of the state. They still tend, in the name of economic and social security, to heap new tasks on the government and thereby new burdens on the taxpayer. The all-pervading problem is the process of growing concentration in the widest sense and in all spheres. Concentration of the power of government and administration, concentration of economic and social power beside and under the state, concentration of decision and responsibility, which thereby become more and more anonymous, unchallengeable, and inscrutable, and concentration of people in organizations, towns, and industrial centers, and firms and factories. If we want to name a common denominator for the social disease of our times, then it is concentration, and collectivism and totalitarianism are merely the extreme and lethal stages of the disease. Market economy looks like one thing in a society where automation, mass proletarianization, and concentration rule. Alternatively, in a society approaching anything like the natural order, wealth would be widely dispersed, people's lives would have solid foundations, genuine communities from the family upward would form a background of moral support for the individual, there would be counterweights to competition in the mechanical operation of prices, people would have roots and would not be adrift in life without anchor, there would be a broad belt of an independent middle class, a healthy balance between town and country, industry and agriculture. The decision on the ultimate destiny of the market economy, with its admirable mechanism of supply and demand, lies, in other words, beyond supply and demand. From Chapter 3, The Conditions and Limits of the Markets. In all honesty, we have to admit that the market economy has a bourgeois foundation. This needs to be stressed all the more because the romantic and socialist reaction against everything bourgeois has, for generations past, been astonishingly successful in turning this concept into a parody of itself from which it is very difficult to get away. The market economy, and with it social and political freedom, can thrive only as a part and under the protection of a bourgeois system. This implies the existence of a society in which certain fundamentals are respected and color the whole network of social relationships: individual effort and responsibility, absolute norms and values, independence based on ownership, prudence and daring, calculating and saving, responsibility for planning one's own life, proper coherence with the community, family feeling, a sense of tradition and the succession of generations combined with an open-minded view of the present and the future, proper tension between individual and community, firm moral discipline, respect for the value of money, the courage to grapple on one's own with life and its uncertainties, a sense of the natural order of things, and a firm scale of values. Whoever turns up his nose at these things or suspects them of being reactionary may in all seriousness be asked what scale of values and what ideals he intends to defend against communism without having to borrow from it. Once we have recognized this necessity of a fundamental choice, we must apply it in practice and draw the conclusions in all fields. It may come as a shock to many of us to realize how much we have already submitted to the habits of thought of an essentially unbourgeois world. This is true, not least, of economists, who like to think in terms of money flows and income flows, and who are so fascinated by the mathematical elegance of fashionable macroeconomic models, by the problems of moving aggregates, by the seductions of grandiose projects for balanced growth, by the dynamizing effects of advertising or consumer credit, by the merits of functional public finance, or by the glamour of progress surrounding giant concerns, who are so fascinated by all this that they forget to consider the implications for the values and institutions of the bourgeois world, for or against which we have to decide. Economism, materialism, and utilitarianism have in our time merged into a cult of productivity, material expansion, and the standard of living. This cult proves once again the evil nature of the absolute, the unlimited, and the excessive. This cult of the standard of living scarcely needs further definition after what we have already said. It is a disorder of spiritual perception of a most pathological nature, a misjudgment of the true scale of vital values, a degradation of man not tolerable for long. It is, at the same time, very dangerous. It will eventually increase rather than diminish what Freud calls the discontents of civilization. The devotee of this cult is forced into a physically and psychologically ruinous and unending race with the other fellow's standard of life, keeping up with the Joneses, as they say in America, and with the income necessary for this purpose. If we stake everything on this one card and forget what really matters, freedom above all, we sacrifice more to the idol than is right, so that, if once the material standard of living should recede by an inch or fail to rise at the rate the cult demands, we remain politically and morally disarmed and baffled. We are deprived of firmness, resistance, and valor in today's world struggle, where more than the standard of life is at stake. We become hesitant and cowardly until it may be too late to realize that exclusive concentration on the standard of living can lose us both that standard and freedom as well. This road to happiness is bound to lead to a dead end sooner or later. As we approach the limits of reasonable consumption, the cult of the standard of life must end up in disillusionment and eventual repugnance. Even now, we are told by Reisman and other American sociologists that the mass of consumers is becoming so blasé that the most spectacular advertising effort can hardly break through. Color television, the second car in the family, the television screen in the private swimming pool. All right, but what then? Fortunately, the moment seems near when people begin to rediscover the charms of books and music, of gardening, and the upbringing of their children. Totalitarianism gains ground exactly to the extent that the human victims of this process of disintegration suffer from frustration and non-fulfillment of their life as a whole, because they have lost the true, preeminently non-material conditions of human happiness. For this reason, it is certain that the decisive battle between communism and the free world will have to be fought not so much on the field of material living conditions, where the victory of the West would be beyond doubt, but on the field of spiritual and moral values. Communism prospers more on empty souls than on empty stomachs. The free world will prevail only if it succeeds in filling the emptiness of the soul in its own manner and with its own values, but not with electric razors. What the free world has to set against communism is not the cult of the standard of living and productivity, or some contrary hysteria, ideology, or myth. This would merely be borrowing communism's own weapons. What we need is to bethink ourselves quietly and soberly of truth, freedom, justice, human dignity, and respect of human life and the ultimate values. For these we must set our course unerringly. We must cherish and strengthen the spiritual and moral foundations of these values and vital goods, and try to create and preserve for mankind such forms of life as are appropriate to human nature and support and protect its conditions. Life is not worth living if we exercise our profession only for the sake of material success, and do not find in it our calling and inner necessity, and a meaning which transcends the mere earning of money, a meaning which gives our life dignity and strength. Whatever we do and whatever our work, we must know what place we occupy in the great edifice of society, and what meaning our activity has beyond the immediate purpose of promoting material existence. This feeling for the meaning and dignity of one's profession and for the place of work in society, whatever work it be, is today lost to a shockingly large number of people. To revive this feeling is one of the most pressing tasks of our times, but it is a task whose solution requires an apt combination of economic analysis and philosophical subtlety. It is the merit of 18th century social and moral philosophy, which is the source of our own discipline of political economy, to have liberated the crafts and commercial activities from the stigma of the feudal era, and to have obtained for them the ethical position to which they are entitled and which we now take for granted. It was a bourgeois philosophy in the true sense of the word, and one might also legitimately call it liberal. It taught us that there is nothing shameful in the self-reliance and self-assertion of the individual taking care of himself and his family, and it led us to assign their due place to the corresponding virtues of diligence, alertness, thrift, sense of duty, reliability, punctuality, and reasonableness. We have learned to regard the individual, with his family, relying on his own efforts and making his own way, as a source of vital impulses, as a life-giving creative force without which our modern world and our whole civilization are unthinkable. In other words, economic life naturally does not go on in a moral vacuum. It is constantly in danger of straying from the ethical middle level unless it is buttressed by strong moral supports. These must simply be there, and, what is more, must constantly be impregnated against rot. Otherwise, our free economic system, and, with it, any free state and society, must ultimately collapse. It is by no means enough to invoke the laws of the market in appealing to people's enlightened self-interest and their economic reason. For within certain limits, cartels, labor unions, pressure groups, and trade associations serve their members' interests very well indeed when they exercise monopoly power or pressure on the government's economic policy in an attempt to get more than genuine and fair competition would give them. There must be higher ethical values which we can invoke successfully: justice, public spirit, kindness, and goodwill. Self-discipline, a sense of justice, honesty, fairness, chivalry, moderation, public spirit, respect for human dignity, firm ethical norms, all of these are things which people must possess before they go to market and compete with each other. These are the indispensable supports which preserve both market and competition from degeneration. Family, church, genuine communities, and tradition are their sources. It is also necessary that people should grow up in conditions which favor such moral convictions, conditions of a natural order, conditions promoting cooperation, respecting tradition, and giving moral support to the individual. Ownership and reserves, and a feeling for both, are essential parts of such an order. We have a little earlier characterized such an order as bourgeois in the broadest sense, and it is the foundation upon which the ethics of the market economy must rest. It is an order which fosters individual independence and responsibility as much as the public spirit which connects the individual with the community and limits his greed. The market economy is a constantly renewed texture of more or less short-lived contractual relations. It can, therefore, have no permanence unless the confidence which any contract presupposes rests on a broad and solid ethical base in all market parties. It depends upon a satisfactory average degree of personal integrity and, at the margin, upon a system of law which counteracts the natural tendency to slip back into less than average integrity. In a sound society, leadership, responsibility, and exemplary defense of the society's guiding norms and values must be the exalted duty and unchallengeable right of a minority that forms and is willingly and respectfully recognized as the apex of a social pyramid hierarchically structured by performance. Mass society, such as we have described it earlier, must be counteracted by individual leadership, not on the part of original geniuses or eccentrics or will-o'-the-wisp intellectuals, but, on the contrary, on the part of people with courage to reject eccentric novelty for the sake of the old truths and for the sake of historically proved, indestructible, and simple human values. In other words, we need the leadership of genuine clerks, or of men such as those whom the distinguished psychiatrist Joachim Baudamer recently described as ascetics of civilization, secularized saints, as it were, who in our age occupy a place which must not for long remain vacant at any time and in any society. That is what those have in mind who say that the, quote, revolt of the masses, quote, must be countered by another revolt, the, quote, revolt of the elite. Quote, the conviction is rightly gaining ground that the important thing is that every society should have a small but influential group of leaders who feel themselves to be the whole community's guardians of inviolable norms and values, and who strictly live up to this guardianship. What we need is true nobilitas naturalis. No era can do without it, least of all ours, when so much is shaking and crumbling away. We need a natural nobility whose authority is, fortunately, readily accepted by all men, an elite deriving its title solely from supreme performance and peerless moral example, and invested with the moral dignity of such a life. Only a few from every stratum of society can ascend into this thin layer of natural nobility. The way to it is an exemplary and slowly maturing life of dedicated endeavor on behalf of all, unimpeachable integrity, constant restraint of our common greed, proved soundness of judgment, a spotless private life, indomitable courage in standing up for truth and law, and generally the highest example. This is how the few, carried upward by the trust of the people, gradually attain to a position above the classes, interests, passions, wickedness, and foolishness of men, and finally become the nation's conscience. To belong to this group of moral aristocrats should be the highest and most desirable aim, next to which all the other triumphs of life are pale and insipid. No free society, at least of all ours, which threatens to degenerate into mass society, can subsist without such a class of censors. The continued existence of our free world will ultimately depend on whether our age can produce a sufficient number of such aristocrats of public spirit, aristocrats of a kind which was by no means rare in the feudal age. We need businessmen, farmers, and bankers who view the great questions of economic policy unprejudiced by their own immediate and short-run economic interest. Trade union leaders who realize that they share with the president of the national bank the responsibility for the country's currency. Journalists who resist the temptation to flatter mass tastes or to succumb to political passions and court cheap success, and instead guide public opinion with moderation, sound judgment, and a high sense of responsibility. In turn, it will be of crucial importance for the ultimate fate of the market economy whether this aristocracy includes, above all, people who, by position and conviction, have close ties with the market economy and who feel responsible for it in the moral sphere here under discussion. One of the obligations of wealth, which need not be enumerated, is to contribute to the filling of the gaps left by the market because they are in the realm of goods outside the play of supply and demand, but which gaps must not be left for the state to fill if we want to preserve a free society. I have in mind the patronage of art in the widest sense, generous grants for a theater, opera, music, the visual arts, and science, briefly for everything whose existence and development would be jeopardized if it had to pay. The most important aspect is the spiritual and moral one. Individualism and utilitarianism, which give the individual's interests and material profits so damaging a predominance, and legal positivism, which sees no further than the written law, must be counterbalanced by all the imponderables which ultimately are the basis of the nation as a permanent entity, and without which disintegration is inevitable. The immutable standards of natural law, community, tradition, historical awareness, love of country, all the things which anchor a community in the hearts of men. The younger the state is, and the more provisional it appears, the more pressingly must all efforts be directed toward this same. To this end, it is invaluable to have independent institutions beyond the arena of conflicts, institutions possessing the authority of guardians of universal and lasting values which cannot be bought. I have in mind the judiciary, the central bank, the churches, universities, and foundations, a few newspapers and periodicals of unimpeachable integrity, an educational system which, by cultivating the universal and the classical, sets up a barrier to the teachings of utilitarianism and the specialization of knowledge, and finally, that natural nobility of which we have already spoken.